want to thank both of you for your presentations today. They've been very interesting. I have a question for Mr. Cruther, and I want to talk about Indigenous women and girls. And Senator Bernard had mentioned annual reports that detail the efforts that were taken by government and private entities to prevent mechanisms of forced labor and child labor. And as I know that on your website, there are many women and girls, particularly Indigenous women and girls, that find themselves in situations of sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. And because of the illicit nature of these industries, can you speak to the extent that the reporting scheme might help these particular Indigenous women and girls? And how would shaming and naming be effective in this case, especially in light of the historically neglected issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women? Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Boyer. That's an excellent question, and I know it's an issue that I guess impacts nations globally in terms of Indigenous populations. I know there's issues there in Canada, issues there in Australia, and issues globally. When you look into operations and supply chains and you go beyond just tier one, often companies or entities, they often will just look at the tier one and the person that they're directly dealing with. But if you go further into supply chains, you do get subcontractors, you do get child labour, you do get things like orphanage trafficking. Orphanage trafficking is, for example, something I've dealt with in the past, where I think it's an estimated over 80% of orphans around the world are not actually orphans. They have a parent or parents or kin or family, and human traffickers take advantage of this orphanage trafficking business model, if I can call it that, to attract donations, often from people who are trying to do the right thing or people who are willing to volunteer. And these children can be taken or coerced from leaving their parents. They can go into a situation of child labour or sexual abuse. They can be trafficked to different locations, and that's certainly an issue that I would like to see tackle more, and I'm sure the Global Fund in Canada and many other international organisations and countries would like to see that issue tackled further as well. We need to implement those programs on the ground to help women and girls and to help Indigenous populations. Hopefully you've all received my written statement I sent through, because I gave an example of, for example, a younger person in the Philippines with 5 children who was assisted by the Global Fund. And often these things are intergenerational. If you have a parent going through a situation of modern slavery or exploitation, their children often end up in the same situation as well. So you need to break that intergenerational disadvantage and to actively intervene in a holistic manner. But the name and shame components of the of Australia's Act, if utilised, and I know that Australia's Act has been recently criticised because I think those name and shame mechanisms have not yet been used. And I think from this year onwards, I think that by using those mechanisms, it will really help people to report, companies and entities to report properly and to report better and to take the issue seriously. But if they are actually looking into the supply chains, let's say you're importing, say, forestry goods into Australia or Canada or elsewhere, 40% of deforestation internationally is linked with forced labour, which often includes child labour. If you look at the renewable energy or clean energy supply chains issues, you have situations like in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where over 35,000 children are in child labour mining cobalt, which is used in lithium-ion batteries, which is used obviously in the renewable energy sector, in electric cars, in your phones, in your computers, and so on. So we need to look at issues like modern slavery and the environment from not just a domestic standpoint, but from an international standpoint. I'm not sure if that answers your question properly, but we need, by actually tackling this issue on a global basis, we can help Indigenous populations and we can help women and girls. And another example on the environmental topic is balsa wood, say in Ecuador, which has been illegally logged and it's impacting Indigenous populations, and that balsa wood is being used for wind turbines. So you're helping one country in terms of producing renewable energy while deforesting another nation and impacting Indigenous populations linked with forced labour. So we need to look at these issues from a holistic global basis.
Thank you. I also want to mention about the trafficking corridors and how important it is to intervene right at that point as well, because that's where the supply chains are going, and that's where the women and the girls are coming in and going out. And that's a critical point there as well. So thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Senator Boyer, you have the floor. Be followed
Thank
by
you,
Senator
Madam
Hartling.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to the three witnesses for sharing your information with us today. I am picking up on Senator Omadvar's question and Mr. Messenger's mentioning of the holistic approach. I do like this approach. I like it because it's a several prong approach, but I'm curious about the means of prevention and protection that you've noticed or advocated for in policy changes of other countries and the way that these changes have curbed the reliance on child labor in certain industries. Can you elaborate on the impacts and the specific examples of how child laborers break free from exploitation after the funding ceases? And how can we ensure via policy or other ways that those vulnerable children are not simply pushed into another situation of coerced labor or other things, bad things? Thanks.
I'm going to pass this over to Mr. Musgrave. Actually, I mean, certainly we can talk about other areas of injustices or human rights where a convention will set the stage and then we act accordingly. But Matt, why don't you respond?
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator, for the question. I think reflecting on your question, the one concept that I think really requires some conversation and reflection from all senators on this committee is really the concept of remediation. When companies identify that there is a risk within their supply chains through this legislation, what do they do with that information? Oftentimes to the conversation, it's not appropriate to simply turn off the valve, remove that supplier or that subcontractor and move on, but there's actually not a responsibility to act. And what does that responsibility truly look like from a company's perspective? And so oftentimes you see companies that find a risk and will actually invest in the education of those children, take them out of that scenario, invest in their education, and put them closer towards a path where they have a legitimate form of work that is not dirty, dangerous, or degrading. But that can only happen when companies have the awareness first to act. And so with this bill, our hope is really that this starts a conversation, and a meaningful conversation, not a conversation that proverbially doesn't go anywhere, but a real conversation with government and companies and the stakeholders like ourselves about what that responsibility truly looks like and what are the opportunities to invest in the real proper remediation that prevents children from re-entering these cycles of extreme poverty and child labor. We actually have a very important opportunity to be able to reverse a lot of these cycles of poverty through this legislation. It's all about how we grasp onto these concepts like remediation and move forward. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. It's definitely a holistic approach, so thank you very much.